Okay, if could, Sharon, if you could make me co-host, I've got one thing to show later on. Unless we have any general questions right now, I'll continue with that. Any general questions anybody wants to raise? All right, we'll have brief office hours at no, this is Monday. We'll have longer office hours if we like at the end. I sent out an email to everyone. We're talking about entrepreneurial mayors. That's the narrow topic. The broader question is, how do the pieces of the course fit together? And we will be going over that. And I think adding another component to what I've talked about in the last two sessions last week. A third big theme I want to illustrate with each of these is how do individual cases and case studies of one mayor, one city connect with bigger global transformational kinds of processes. That is, transformational processes like the movement from clientelism to class politics to post-industrial, that kind of thing, along with specific cities, specific mayors, and how these connect to distinctly globalization processes like Genghis Khan's invasion or Wall Street accounting firms and their connections. So what we're doing today will have some of all of these, but I'm articulating that they are abstract, different parts of thinking about global local that you can build on and have in the back of your head. I'm not just telling stories. There's a framework that you can see illustrated in each reading and each observation if we look. And I'm just encouraging you to look and to take that away with you and join it with what you're learning in other courses, or if there are conflicts with other courses, let's talk about them and see if we can connect them somehow meaningfully, so that what's in your heads when you finish the course is stronger and better. Okay. I'll start with a couple of individual cases and build up because they're pretty dramatic. People often ask about mistakes or failures, implying that Daley or Harold Washington were successes. First point is it's not clear that there were such successes as they had their counsels against them. Daley less in his later years, but Daley too was not elected by the Democratic Party. He had to fight the traditional clientelist leaders. I mean, remember I mentioned that in a talk he gave here, Daley too, when asked, first question from the students was, didn't you learn how to be mayor from your father? And he said, we never talked about politics in the home. Politics is dirty stuff. We don't do that at home. At least quote unquote, that's what he said. More specifically, when he tried to run, the Cook County Democratic Party organization did not back him. He had to fight the party to run for mayor, even though his father built that party into what it was. Okay, so later on, when after Harold Washington died, Daley said, and then later on, I think maybe it was the 10th or 20th anniversary after Harold Washington died, Daley said, I took my politics from Harold Washington. And if you look at what he did in the context of Chicago, I've sometimes said he was closer to Harold Washington than he was to his own father. And that's true publicly. It's not necessarily true privately, where he had more clientelistic activities still going on, but he at least publicly would not say he would never have said and never said the kind of thing his father did when his father said, you know, how come you gave those contracts to your son's insurance firm? What's the famous answer you can all take away and tell your aunt? It's a father's duty to help his sons. Okay, that's the old Chicago politics, and that's what people still do in much of the world. Okay. Daley too would say instead what Harold Washington said, which when asked the same question, which was, what would anybody roughly guess or imagine? How would you state that? We went through competitive bidding, the best legal procedures we could. And if we find anybody in my staff in the city of Chicago violating them, we will do the utmost to prosecute them to the full extent of the law. That's what Harold Washington said in answer to the same question. Totally against clientelism. Daley too would say the same publicly. Okay. Nevertheless, if you compare Chicago to Palo Alto or some other places, New England, nice little villages, there's a lot of clientelism in Chicago today. Okay. Chicago was termed Beirut on the Lake, and the council wars with the normal day-to-day meetings were meetings of the Chicago City Council. Okay, we could go on and you'll hear, so the reading for this section, which elaborates this, is called Trees and Real Violins. It's an oral history that began when Harold Washington started running for mayor, and I started it with the campaign manager of Harold Washington himself, Bill Grimshaw, and his wife. They were the campaign managers. And we interviewed all kinds of people who had been actively involved in the Harold Washington campaign, and then continued on with Daley, with other, and with later mayors, and updated. And so the course, we've taught a couple of courses with other people in the Chicago area who work on, some of them narrowly on Chicago politics, others like me, broad, sort of looking at Chicago in a global perspective. What can we learn and how can we connect Chicago to Bogota? We'll get there to the bigger by asking a question or an independent question answer with some comparative data. So here's a question: how do you join comparative and local data? One case with a bigger framework and a bigger set of data. Robert Putnam, whose book on Italy we read, was good in the sense that it was a case study of Italy. And it said, here's where and why civic organizations are important. And he had a theory of why the South was different. The South was different because the Norman invasion governed hierarchically, whereas the cities in the North, Genoa, Venice, and so forth, were involved in trade, and they became more cosmopolitan, they became more democratic. And today, in Italy, you find those differences persisting. Okay, Putnam did the same kind of thing quantitatively. He did a survey of all the counties, and not all, but I think the biggest city counties in the U.S. and then asked citizens. This is a survey of average citizens in each of these cities, and asked them questions. How much do you trust the mayor? How good a job are the civic organizations doing? How much trust do you have in the whole city, and so forth? And sort of, it's the same kinds of questions that were informing his study of Italy and informing his Bowling Alone book. But he then went into the individual cities, and which city had the lowest trust, the most disagreement, the most difficulty, people using the nastiest labels for their own leaders and for their own city. Which major city was this in the US? Los Angeles. So other people then have followed up trying to say, why is Los Angeles so much resented by its local citizens? And many of the critiques were involved with Mexican migration, drugs, crime, gangs, battles in schools, border patrols with bitter referenda, recalling the governor, the citizen surveys by Putnam. All of them showed that compared to the, here we go, 60 other metro areas in the US, the LA trust levels are the lowest. And if one asks separately among African Americans or Mexicans or whites, they don't trust people they know among their own ethnic group. The strong Calvinist individualism became a cowboy tradition, as we saw from Elazar, joined with wheels. That is the moving to the West. People left New England, they left Europe. As they kept migrating from place to place, they lost their sense of rootedness, and they lost the sense of sort of sharper norms. That's the sort of frontier hypothesis. In LA, it joins with wheels and the freeway mentality, and the huge disparities in cultural styles feed into conflict. These were partially present in Chicago and other cities, but immigrant separatism was dramatically overcome by the party in Chicago and political leaders who locally sought to build an organization that would join people of multiple ethnic groups through the Democratic Party. So it would join everybody to work together in the city council. Related to these findings was, what did they do in LA? The council members were concerned all the more that basically they fought and they disagreed. They have big districts, or some are at large, and the city council members were concerned all the more when another version of how much trust is there, when the citizens had a referendum from when Hollywood and the San Fernando Valley almost won, that is, people had the referendum to secede from LA, the referenda almost passed, yet, okay, so that led to the city council and the mayor saying, we got to do something to not be so bad. Yet their conceptual map, the question is, what do we do if we have distrust? Their conceptual map was what we saw last week, Tuckville. What we need to build trust is more civic organizations. That's Putnam's Northern Italy. If they did it in Northern Italy, if it did it in New England, we ought to do more of it here in LA. That's what the great majority of the discussion said. I went to council meetings, I talked with the experts, et cetera. I went to public hearings. Lots and lots of people said this. So they said, well, okay, what we need to do is create a lot of little organizations. We can call them neighborhood councils. So they created over 90 of these in LA. And then they started doing evaluations of them. How are these working? They asked people who went to the meetings. They asked, they asked trust over time. What difference does it make through these little district organizations? Will they transform the low trust upward? When I visited LA several times, and I taught at UCLA, I went back, we have an ongoing debate with the so-called LA school that I've talked about briefly. I went to meetings, especially at USC, where there was an evaluation study of the local councils, including the surveys. And basically they found that the educated, more highly educated middle-class areas like Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, Pacific Palisades, democracy was working fine. We have good, middle-class folks. We follow those rules, sort of the same as the ideals of Tuckville, and people generally trust their leaders. But by contrast, if you go to the more clientelist neighborhoods of traditional lower status Mexicans and African Americans, lots of distrust. I wrote a few papers on this. I discussed them with California and LA folks who basically were wringing their hands and saying nothing seems to work. And by nothing, they meant it doesn't work the way we thought it would from the New England model. So they had the wrong framework, I suggested. This came exactly at the time when Antonis Mocus was mayor in Bogota. And I made a general point that American cities had gotten lots of migration, especially from Mexico. And rather than saying Mexicans are the problem, I said, let's look south of the border and see what's happening. If we look at nearby Mexico, we find it has many of the same problems as LA: high crime, low trust, minimal civic activity. And low civic activity is true all across Latin America. So Putnam doesn't work in that sense. So I won't say work, but the plus and minus descriptively is low trust, low civic activity. So maybe Putnam is that's what we call Model 2 in the beginning of the book, Can Tuckville Carry? Okay. let me pass on and skip that point. Just one quick example from the Mexico City governor of the area was trying to show that he could be a reformer. So he followed something adapted from Bogota. And he said, male men who are police officers cannot give speeding tickets. Women can. Women police officers in Mexico can give speeding tickets. Okay, I won't. So let's go back to some of the sources of this kind of thing. The innovation is interesting in combination with another MOCUS invention. Colombia and Bogota had roughly 6 times the US murder rate, and the traffic police were seen as too corrupt to work with. So MOCUS created a ladies' out night where men were not welcome in the bars and clubs. Then they looked at the police statistics and they found 0 murders in those nights. This at least gave the participants a sense that local culture again could be changed. It wasn't that local culture was rigid or that government was hierarchical and nothing could change. Nobody before had done this. It's a wild idea. Women only in the bars, no murders. Hey, maybe we can change things by doing some small adjustment of that sort. And so it was followed elsewhere. Okay, let's look at a bit of MOCUS here, and I will, if I can try to show it myself, maybe this will work. What if we do this with your permission? And here we go. I chose this and I share. And it says participants can see, but I don't. Okay, well, where do I get to this? Okay, here we go. Did you see it now? You see the Daniel Cornell reporter on your screen?
Yep.
Yes, okay, so do I. Okay. All right.
Pero no sabían muy bien para dónde.
So do you have, sorry, do you have good sound, loud sound? No. Okay, let me check what we need to have in that system. This is the mistake that we made before we started it a week or so ago. I'm gonna stop the share. I'll go back to down. No. Who can remind me where that thing is? We need to have the image. Okay, so I start, share the screen. I get the chart. Here we go. Just so you all learn this. Lower left corner, share sound. I'm checking that now. And I've checked MOCUS. No.
Yo recuerdo que cuando él empezó, inventó los mimos,
yes
la prensa se reía de ataques.
De estos largos y oscuros túneles ubicados bajo el centro de Bogotá, se preparan 20 jóvenes que pretenden enseñarles a los habitantes de la ciudad cómo vivir civilizadamente en una capital.
Es a través del arte, ¿sí? A través de nuestra postura de la estética y de la ética, vamos a poner en servicio nuestro trabajo para dar educación ciudadana.
Let me interrupt for a second. The background, which we'll get a little more of as we're continuing, is corruption was huge. MOCUS fired the whole traffic police, all the traffic police. He replaced them, there were over a couple of thousand, he replaced them with mimes who would direct the traffic instead of the traffic policemen. And his top staff said, this is ridiculous. Nobody's gonna follow this. They'll just laugh at you, you silly mayor. And here's what happened.
Creo que la disposición a dejarse corregir es el complemento que espero frente a los mismos. O sea, los mismos solos no bastan. Ahora necesitamos que la gente acepte al mismo.
Y es sumamente interesante ver cómo poco a poco va calando la idea, porque es una idea que no se basa exclusivamente en el show.
Personas que hasta el día anterior no lo respetaban y no los atemorizaba la fuerza de la autoridad, la multa, empezaron a cumplir eso.
It seemed like a crazy idea, but the traffic mimes become a great success. Mogus decides to disband the notoriously corrupt traffic police. He lets 3,200 officers go. Out of them, 400 take up his offer to be re-educated as mimes. But the police commissioners deny corruption and pressure Mogus to stop the program.
Entonces estaba yo con el secretario de tránsito, el general de la policía y los representantes de los policías corruptos locales. Y yo le dije al hombre, mira, yo saldría a los medios y diría lo que usted me está pidiendo que diga, siempre y cuando usted crea lo que me está diciendo. Entonces, para yo creerle a usted lo que usted me está diciendo, usted me va a repetir lo que usted quiere que yo diga mirándome a los ojos. El tipo dijo, ¿qué? Le dije yo, que me diga qué es lo que yo tengo que decir mirándome a los ojos. Y cada vez que el hombre llegaba a decir que no eran corruptos, el hombre me bajaba la mirada. Le dije yo, primera vez, no fue capaz. Vuelva a ver si es capaz de decirme. Segunda vez, no. Tercera vez le dije yo, se acabó la reunión. Por su corrupción se acabó este negocio. Se pueden ir para sus casas y nos vemos en los tribunales.
The culture of corruption Mogus is battling is pervasive at all levels of Colombian society. Every politician and bureaucrat is expected to provide favors to a network of friends and relatives.
We made an agreement when we were working out our development plan that the relationship with the councilmen will be without contracts and without people put in office by recommendation of councilmen.
The politicians did whatever they wanted. They appointed the people. They even had direct interference with who the contractors would be. And Antanas Mocos came and said, no interference from the politicians at all.
Lo que no nos puede exigir el alcalde es que todos pensemos exactamente igual a él.
Me parece que el alcalde es un neoanarquista que evidentemente preferiría gobernar sin el órgano legislativo que es el Consejo.
Era decir, de aquí no se pasa. La corrupción es intolerable. Los jueguitos y los beneficios. Yo tengo que ser rígida con mis amigos, más rígida con los que conozco. Yo no puedo estar aquí trayendo.
Okay. Any quick questions just on Bogota and on what happened there? I think you get the main points if you could read those underlines in English. Corruption, obvious, pervasive, standard operating rule of the game. Mocha said no, he ran on it, and he won. He beat he had no political party. The leading political parties backed other candidates and the existing council. He ran as an independent. He'd been president of the university, and he was fired by the president of the country because I won't go into the history enough to except to say, he was fired as president of the university. He was a professor of, I think, of mathematics, and then he joined philosophy as well. Educated in Europe, France, and he came back. His mother was an artist, and he had this style of trying to build a new city and a new society. So he was very ambitious. At the same time, he was not a good rhetorician. He didn't do the standard elegant, polished speeches and so forth, but he had these amazing kinds of policies, and many of them worked. So what I'm illustrating here is there's some dramatic extreme cases. And if we're talking to people in LA and you say that people who come from Mexico and south of the border are corrupt, they're irresponsible, they just want drugs and crime, look south of the border and here's a lesson of the opposite happening. And there are elements of things like this, but less dramatic across Latin America, across Africa, across Asia, and within the American South, and within the city of Chicago, where corruption is a dominant rule of the game in many of those areas. So corruption defined in the people's own terms, social scientists talk more of clientelism. Okay. How can we more generally connect something like the survey of Putnam with individual cities and of citizens with the broader kinds of questions which are being asked there? One is to do a scatter plot where you have, say, all American cities or all over 10,000 or the metro areas that Putnam surveyed, and then look where on some key dimensions of income or immigration or age, that individual's case falls. And so what I did was choose the extreme of low trust in terms of one dimension, and then look at other kinds of variables on the other. That is, what might be the factors that go into making low trust, and how much are they shared in other places, as well as the ways, if we can get these components, are these ways that we can also find ways of pursuing alternatives, not just imagining them. And the economists talk about normative economics and positive economics. I'm showing you how you can use the ideas of positive social science to answer, or at least address, the components of answers to normative questions. That not as to say it might be right if we had a pure market and just ceteris paribus assume a pure market. That instead of doing that, look for one city where one sector where there is a lot of competition, freedom to entry, and the components of free markets are really there. And look at other cities or other sectors where the opposite holds, and then see if that makes a difference. Okay, so and use actual data on individual cities and neighborhoods as they exist, and some people are doing this. Okay, one more quick example like that. The whole book called City Money, which I did following the New York fiscal crisis, was to say, why did New York City go bankrupt? Basically, I mean, we had growth in all American cities in aggregate from 1945 up through the 70s. Then we had a fiscal crisis in New York in 73, 74, and then after that, there were cutbacks. There was a huge amount of retrenchment in some locations, some cities, some neighborhoods, some spending areas, and then opposition. So you have a new left emerging. So we have lots of transformations going on. So when we looked at individual cities after and simultaneous with the New York City fiscal crisis, we found Pittsburgh looked like New York, older, Northeastern, traditional Democratic Party, lots of clientelism, white ethnic group, Catholics, it tended to be politically important. Irish often in the top positions, like Chicago. So we knew that. We wanted to know given that they had these shared characteristics with Chicago and parts of New York, but New York was spending way at the top, and Pittsburgh in the same years, 60s and 70s, sorry, let me not go too far. Pittsburgh, when Mayor Peter Flaherty became mayor, was cutting back at the same time that John Lindsay was increasing spending. What did Pittsburgh do that made the normal New York Times explanation, the normal explanation of the New Yorker leaders themselves? So, there's nothing we can do about the New York fiscal crisis. We have the problem shared with all the cities in the Northeast. We have lots of poor people. People need welfare. They need hospitals. We build hospitals, and we're going bankrupt because we're trying to help everybody. Okay, why is Pittsburgh any different? That's what we said. Let's go find out. So I asked a bunch of research assistants and students, who wants to go to Pittsburgh? Nobody wanted to go to Pittsburgh. I want to stay in Chicago, where we like it right here. So I said, okay, I'll go to Pittsburgh myself. So I spent a while there, and I found out that, in fact, I happened to know the chief of staff of Peter Flaherty, and I spent hours and hours and hours with him. Got lots of documentation, and there's a chapter in the book called City Money on Pittsburgh. But the point is, this was the beginning of what we call the new political culture, and that's one of our key bigger readings, which is on the reading list for today. And so I'm illustrating how the way we discovered things like this new political culture is not just from it's not just numbers, and it's not just the case study, it's the combination of both. We knew it was an outlier statistically. The question is, why is it so different from other places? And let's get a combination of these sources to try to figure out how it works. And this idea of exploring how the new political culture works, we pursued in 7 books because there were different kinds of things which we could assess: citizens, organized groups, mayors, and we have different, and then class politics is a key kind of alternative to the new political culture. Why is class politics still so dominant in much of the world? And these are individual books. I'm just drawing on some of the big pictures right now, and saying that one way of organizing this in the book City Money was that we had a chapter on each of 4 general political cultures: the traditional Democratic left, the traditional Republican right, ethnic politicians like the traditional Republican right was San Diego, case there. Traditional Democratic was Boston. The traditional ethnic city was Gary, Indiana. And the 4th case was Pittsburgh with Peter Flaherty as the new political culture. Okay, so then how are these each different? We went into not only with some of the statistical data, but with cases of subtle specifics. How do they, how's the feel? How do these rules of the game, these political cultures, differ from each other? And publishing some of this led me to be identified by the US Conference of Mayors, and I spent a number of years consulting in Washington, lobbying the White House, working with leading mayors on these kinds of issues. National innovators were looking for new ideas as well as arguing with each other, trying to sharpen better ways of doing things. Milwaukee had top mayors, initially Henry Mayer, who M-A-I-E-R, who was the father of general revenue sharing, major grant program nationally. And then later on, James Norquist, who took Milwaukee in the total opposite direction. He cut spending, whereas his earlier mayors were huge increase in favor of more spending. So our whole project was called Fiscal Austerity and Urban Innovation after the New York fiscal crisis, because we started with the idea that maybe fiscal austerity will create innovation, or might it? It was the question. Even though most mayors and most local officials say the reason we can't innovate is that we don't have enough money because we don't have enough staff and we have to fight fires. But in fact, if we correlate income with innovation, we find it's about 0. Innovative cities are almost no more likely to be rich or poor if you just look at the income of the residents. The most innovative cities are often around the middle. Often they house more middle, this is in the US, at least in these, roughly in these years that we've studied this in some detail. Highly, especially educated residents, but also lots of middle income for people who don't want to do things in any one traditional way. So they often fight locally in the city council, but then look for ways of resolving the conflicts that can bring innovation and responsiveness to multiple different constituencies. We also created an award program, which in Illinois we called Urban Innovation in Illinois, where we gave prizes using panels of local officials and case studies of the innovations, which were really working. And then others in the audience could then ask questions, critique, and if they wanted, or and say, why should I do this? Or didn't you have this problem, which we would have in Evanston, or we have in Oak Park, and we couldn't do that because, etc. We started at these levels of innovation, which were pretty low. Over 15 years, it dramatically improved. The cities grew a lot more innovative. I can't say how much was due to us, but the spirit of the time was to innovate. And we show that one general reason for this was that the NPC leaders were ideologically committed to a new political culture, which meant spend the same or less, don't be a big spender, but be liberal, left, progressive on social issues for women, for minorities, for immigration, for gays and lesbians, and so forth. How can you combine those two things? Both the traditional left and traditional right, so you can't. You've either got to choose the one or the other. Economics and politics and policy and citizens are so tightly interrelated. You're a hypocrite if you try to be one or the other, anything except the one or the other, traditional Democrat or traditional Republican. The ethnic politicians challenged it in their way, and most of all, so did the new political culture people like Peter Flaherty. And then in another book on citizens, we found roughly 70% of citizens in the US and Western Europe and Japan all support these ideas. Most people are not racist. They're not in favor of police beating people up. Everybody's against, I won't say everybody, 70% of people in Japan, in France, in England, in all Italy and the US, they all feel, that is, citizens feel this way. However, there are huge differences in how these political systems work and how especially their national parties have different ideological commitments that do not reflect the local citizens. The US, and this is in the New Political Culture book, the US is the only country of these major, with Canada, only the US, with the US, with Canada and Australia, less known, less studied, and so I don't play them up so much, but the Europeans basically have no relationship between what the socioeconomic characteristics of their citizens, income, education, race, poverty, immigration status, and so forth. You correlate those things with the policies and the spending patterns of the mayors and the cities, and they're 0 in Europe. In the US, they're relatively strong. That is, in general, cities that have more poor people spend more money on redistribution. People with more poor people mayors and city council members try to help the poor more, whereas people who don't have so many poor people don't do as much of those policies. Okay, that same pattern is 0 in Europe. Why? Because the parties are so strong and they don't reflect their citizens. Okay, so let's push on. Let me say a few words more generally and then come back to some specifics and discuss. Let me make the point with the last week and this week, we're reading 3 books that fit together. Tocqueville Karaoke, The New Political Culture, and Scenescapes. Scenescapes was the longest we spent, in the sense of we spent 12 years writing that book. The others were maybe 5 or so, and et cetera. But when you write a book, and you often rewrite it 20 times, maybe, lots of different things. So we get lots of ideas along the way. We try things out, things don't work, or we then why was our hypothesis wrong? So we try to figure that out. Then we get, say, 8 chapters and say, okay, now we've got the core of the book. Now at the end, let's write the introduction and the conclusion. And it's at that point we try to build some propositions and say, how and why do these propositions work, both as background hypotheses, more general, and then more specific, and what did we find, or how might we find them, and how, that is, did we find support for these hypotheses? And sometimes we invent them, but usually these are hypotheses that people are fighting about. They're killing each other in their city councils and when they run for mayor. And so we try to, we want to connect with those things that people are arguing about and say, this is what's working or not working and why locally. Then we try to test those with the data which we have. Okay, the point I'm making is, take a look, for you as students in the course, when you've got these 3 books, look at the similar kinds of boxes and arrows, and you find, and in the front of each of these 3 books, especially Scenescapes and The New Political Culture, you find very similar kinds of frameworks. And I put the same kind of thing on the board, or in figuratively in the beginning of this course. That is, we've got leadership in the middle, like who's the mayor? Is he or she black or white? Are they Democratic or Republican? Are they new political culture? Then we got policies that come from them, like higher spending or lower spending on poverty. Then we got background characteristics, such as where and why do we find these sorts of mayors? How did they get elected? And in Europe, the party is a major answer. In the US, the parties are much weaker in explaining who the leader is. So looking at these kinds of factors, putting them together, we try to then connect this abstract sounding or looking kind of set of boxes and arrows with the details chapter by chapter, and say what fits and what doesn't. And if it doesn't fit, why does it not fit? Using the results that we have, both abstract theory and then very concrete evidence from examples, from case studies, from participant observation fieldwork, as I did in Pittsburgh and in other places on each of these 4 mayors, and thus joining the richness and the subtlety of the best case study work, ideally with the big data comparisons which are available, if you have some examples of at least aspects of the right data that we can test a big general hypothesis, such as rich people do things differently, or rich people are more innovative, false, etc. I'll just flag a little bit some of the points. So I'm making that point. Look at these big things and try to look at how these fit together with the whole course, and how the sections of each of the sections of the course connect to each other and to the what you're reading page by page in each of these books. And the big finding just of how they fit together was, and I'll elaborate this when we have another session later on, but the general background is agriculture leading to clientelism, industrialization leading to class politics, post-industrialization leading to Paris and the new political culture, where people pursue socially liberal but fiscally cautious kinds of things. And then later on, reactions against this new political culture, built against, that is, if we think of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and Francois Mitterrand as international examples of presidents that made this style famous, we've then got people who fight against them, such as Trump. So Trump and the populist mayors of presidents of countries in Brazil, the Philippines, and in different ways, Italy, around the world, we have the so-called populist mayors. Aspects of their populism, that is especially the term populism of citizens, goes back to the end of the 19th century. That's an American tradition of being very responsive to the voter and against the party leaders, against the elites of all sorts. And that's the style, at least, that Trump would try to present when he wore his populist hat. Okay. So what I'm giving then is the big themes from these books, each fit together. And I didn't mention Kentuckville Karaoke separately, but the point is the big theories then of where and why we get these urban economic innovations. And the answer, lifestyle, innovation, in innovation, and the arts, and transgression in the arts, as articulated by Balzac and Baudelaire, led to innovation, or the Richard Florida's Rise of the Creative Class. There are lots of discussion of this now. So that theory fell flat in Asia. And the other theory of Tocqueville, building consensus, trust, fell flat in Korea, and then the rest in many other countries of the world. Why do these Western theories not work? We start from that and then go to individual cases and begin to try to see how we can connect these. And that is what we're doing in all of these generally is adding context, sharpening the context, not just saying China's different. What specifically about China makes it different that changes the relationship between income and trust, or being a professional and trusting the government less? Professionals in China trust the government less. Less educated rural people in China trust the government more. That's the opposite of the rest of the world. Why? Okay, that's still an open question, which we're exploring with the Chinese. Okay. So just then so I'm connecting the four books of City Money. City Money came historically first, and we identified this Peter Flaherty example. We then talked about it as a case. We then pursued the New Political Culture book internationally, when we found these same things going on, said, hey, this is not just the US, it's not just Pittsburgh, this is happening in France, it's happening in Germany, and so forth, in 20 countries. Then we went to, then we said, it's called the New Political Culture Issues. The next book really was Kentuckville Karaoke, where then the dependent variable included more on the arts. We found the arts really made a difference. And in terms of class politics, the arts were more separate from class politics than were other policies like welfare. Welfare levels were more closely related to classic left-right party programs. Not so for the arts. The arts were then a way of innovating, that mayors who were innovative could build a populist, artistic, charismatic following, even if they didn't want to spend more money. And I'll just mention, Trump had no campaign money at the beginning. He was elected, he didn't spend his own money minimally. That is, he tweeted. It was a revolution in politics around the world. I mean, everybody said, you can't you can't win anything if you just have these tweets. All right, so all right, so my point is if we don't talk about is Trump good or bad, that's a stupidly silly question. Which components of Trump have been borrowed, just as which components of Harold Washington do we live with today? And how do these, and here's a bottom line. Why do you as students here And in your future, when you're looking at these things changing, why do they change? So why do they, my answer is, first of all, look and see, are they really different? Are they changing? And the answer may well be yes, for sure. We're going to have changes next week, 5 years from now, 10 years, there'll be lots of changes. But second, so look for changes by having some kinds of data which says, there really is a change. Simple examples, are there more women in city councils? And if there are more women in city councils, does that change policy? And which policies? And that's something we pursue in detail with the data and the context of the past in the New Political Culture book. But if we go to the future and we look at not just to Chicago, but cities and nations globally, there are huge differences within countries and within cities, especially the diverse city. I won't say any, most big cities, certainly in the US and in many countries of the world, are highly diverse. You can find neighborhoods that are drastically different from each other. Put differently, you don't need to leave Chicago to do field work in Afghanistan if you want to interview people from Afghanistan. You can find a fair number of them right here in Chicago. Then you can contrast people who are from Denmark or from Mexico or from somewhere else. Okay, so the point is to choose your cases for case studies analytically and ways that you can then connect with comparative data and use all of those together to interpret what you're seeing. If you just write down your so-called field notes as if you're a quote objective, that's simply naive. Okay, but if you begin to push yourself, articulate, why did I see that? What is important? What does that mean? If I'm looking for class, I'm looking for race, I'm looking for gender. If that's what you're looking for, fine. But how is it different from other cities or in the past? So we're getting to this. The second kind of question is, what are the causal linkages? And that's what we try to articulate in the beginnings of each of these books, and then usually summarizing at the end of a chapter or the end of the whole book, how the whole picture fits together. Then I'm contrasting, 20 plus years of books, 40, I've written and edited about 40 books. I usually work with other people and we learn in the process of writing the book. And that's wonderful. That's what's exciting. And we may not be in the same room at all. We may be people in Korea and China and France, all writing the same book together. And arguing with each other for 7 years before we can publish it. That's what happened especially with Kentucky Karaoke. So I'm telling you this not to be biographical, but to try to say, how can you use what you're reading to help you see and think and articulate more creatively what you're seeing when you go back to your hometown, or when you just think about, how was the high school in my, and here at the USC, I'm finding people are pretty different from me. Why are they different? Were their high schools different? Were their countries different? How much was the nation? And so, one thing, for instance, I might have say, we'd have a research group with 7 Chinese and then some Americans and a Canadian or 2. If we had, and I remember, I just cite this example of having, say, 7 Chinese, because we'd then say, well, so we talk about something with a Norwegian and a Canadian, and they'd say, well, yeah, welfare states do this. Then we say, well, how does that work in China? And we often would get 7 different answers from 7 different Chinese, which made it all the more interesting. So then we try to say, why are we getting 7 different answers? We thought China was one big integrated national party, one communist party, one planning commission. Isn't everybody doing the same thing with the same bureaucracy? No. And in many cases, there's more federalism, there's more decentralization in China than there is in other places. There's a famous book called The China Report. It's the most famous epidemiological studies of health and a little bit of politics, but it's mostly about health and diet, exercise, things like that. And they find that these have changed less in China over hundreds of years, that people go back hundreds of years in these things in ways that make Europe and the US look, very, very short term. So that the tradition of very local areas in China make China a very different country. And it's not at all coming from a US Constitution, which says we're federalism and China is not. The ancientness, that's why we had the section on Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is not there because of some constitution. He went in there with his horsemen, and brought drastic changes across Russia, China, Iraq, Iran, etc., up to Poland. So if we look at these components, terror, violence, murder, assassination, firing a whole, burning an entire city, these are analogous in a sense to what Mayor Mocus did in Bogota. And I would say in some respects, that the 19th century and early 20th century, or mid to late 20th century view of class politics just coming closer to present. We can't study everything. It's not a history course. How do we have things? How can we give you things which matter for the present based on the relatively recent past and then go into the future? And my quick answer is some things are clear, but if we ask, for instance, what's the biggest cleavage in American politics as shown by voting? What is it? Race. Blacks vote differently than whites. Is that class politics? Is that racial politics in the late 20th century? Is it because what's in people's heads? He's a racist, therefore he votes against me. No, it's a feudal cleavage. It goes back to feudal Europe where they had slavery. And the first slaves in America were not blacks. They were Englishmen who'd stolen a plate from somebody's family, and they got put in a ship in the Thames. And then when they couldn't be shipped to Australia, or that is, the prisons in England got filled up, so they shipped these people, and after 20 years of hard work on the cotton in Virginia, they could come back to England. They were replaced by African Americans in the late 18th century. And so slavery was not an invention of African Americans in the US. It was invented by the English and German and French and the Russian systems of slavery. And of course they had it with Genghis Khan and with others as well. So it persists. And the history of slavery, I'm just using that example to say these obvious huge examples of, quote, diversity that we talk about are not just what's in one person's head. These are having some sense of how these variations come together and come from different distinctive backgrounds can give you a richer sense of why Bridgeport is different from Hyde Park, is different from the near North Side, or different from Oak Park or Evanston, or maybe your hometown. At least that's what we're trying to do. Okay, I can go on about some of the individual cases more, or other themes, but let me pause here and see what we've got in the way of discussion, and we'll and then I'll bring in more if we don't have enough points that you raise. Questions on any topic? And you see I'm linking this as well to the 2 sessions last week with those readings, and of course implicitly back to globalization with markets in the first section on the economy, and then the section on El-Azhar and Genghis Khan as deeper structures, which are all, or that is all, to put in one sentence, these are all around us right now. In your dormitory, you can find all of these cleavages if you look, if you talk to people and ask them the right questions. Question. Okay, here we have Abshek, or no, is that, was your hand up, or was that you just raising your hand up?
No, I was just like doing like that.
Okay, you're just waving in the air. All right. All right. We have some folks who've asked good questions before. I'll call on some of you if you don't have any, that is, any descriptive kind of observation or question such as how is this different in Rochester, New York, is a legitimate point to bring in this context. We have a different, we have different readings today than we did last week. So why don't we start with that? How's this fit in Rochester? Suzanne?
Honestly, I'm not too familiar with any mayors that are local, so I'm not entirely sure.
What do you know anything about any of the mayors of Rochester?
No.
Okay, well, no, but that alone is important, that many Americans can't tell you the name of their own mayor. So don't be embarrassed. I don't mean to make fun of you at all. I'm on the contrary, I'm celebrating your honesty and openness, because people have done surveys of this. They give them lists of names or ask them for positions. What's the name of your state senators? What's the name of the capital of your state, and so forth? Most people don't know. So the point is, this is especially important at the USC, where we have, say, the economics department, and then people from economics who then go to, or now they've solved all the issues of the economy in terms of perfect models. So they're coming, so Gary Becker for the last 30 years and his students, they're studying families, they're studying churches, they're studying cities, they're studying unions, but they start with often, however, as in the economic theory democracy book of Anthony Downs, they'll start with, say, if we follow a standard economic model, that we have perfect information, freedom of entry, and then we have competition, then we get this. But you're illustrating, if most people don't know the name of the mayor, they also then don't know what they did, and then we can't have competition of the sort which the ideal model of competition posits. The reason I'm saying this explicitly is not to criticize the economists, but to say people at the USC in every department, you're all very smart, you're quite well informed, you're damn good at least some things. You tend to think, as I told you, when we had the Occupy Chicago movement here, I went with a bunch of students, and we all went out, we did field work and talked to people and said, what are you doing in this protest for? What do you feel about it? What are the problems, etc. And most of the USC students came back and said, oh, these people they're no good. They don't have any program. They don't know what that is. If they had heard you say what you just said, Suzanne, most people don't know who their mayor is, they might have had a more informed theory. So put differently, most people at other universities and colleges don't care and don't know as much as we do, especially if you're taking this class, we do about politics. And so recognizing what we can call uncertainty or information to make it a variable. It's not that one is right or wrong, or you're smart or stupid. You focused on other things rather than the name of the mayor and what they did. But most people, okay, but that's important. I mean, you've made a contribution by saying, I don't know the name of the mayor. Okay. If we go to Shingini, can you name your mayor?
No.
Okay, that's terrific. So the first two people, okay. I've applaud twice as much. First two people asked that this is fantastic. Okay, good job indeed. Charlotte Stender, can we try you? Let's take a small survey here of a couple of people who are, can you show us a face and the name of your mayor, or say, no, I don't know. Okay.
I'm from Chicago, so Lori Lightfoot.
Okay. Okay, so you know the name. All right, so thank you. Shula Mixie Ray.
I'm from Delhi in India. We don't really have the mayoral system, but I know who my chief minister is, if that counts.
Okay, sure. Okay, now that's good. If you in Delhi, what would you guess might be the number of citizens in Delhi who know, or that is, do you think citizens in Delhi are more or less knowledgeable than citizens in Chicago or Rochester, New York, or another city? You think you're about the same as the US or very different in these regards?
I think the system in India, I think of just a political hierarchy is not, it's very different. So the level of knowledge that I would have about, say, who my chief minister is, there is a hierarchy below that, which like you have candidates of the party who are responsible for smaller constituencies. I don't know who the candidate for my constituency is, but I guess people will have knowledge of the rung on that ladder that's one above that. So I mean, it depends on the level at which you're looking, but I do think it, interestingly, I feel like it is more the low income areas who will have deeper connections with their local party candidate, because I feel like they will need to avail the resources that they could provide them more. But I think in general, because the political system is very different, people will know who their chief minister is, but then it depends on what kind of neighborhood you live in, whether or not you know your local candidate and your local MLA or whatever.
Okay. I'll just
add on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Professor, I'll just add, like, so Delhi does have mayors, like South Delhi will have a mayor, East Delhi will have a mayor. It's like municipal corporation, if you remember that. So they have that kind of a structure. So they are mayors, but they are not that prominent. So I understand why you don't know. Like, so a lot of cities, like the urban cities, they do have mayors, but people are not aware about mayors because it is centralized on the state government. More of like, you'll know your chief minister, but you won't know your mayors. You won't know like who's your municipal corporation head and all. And that has been there. So it has been decentralized on state and center, but centralized on center state, like on the state level. So you don't know like your local leaders and all. Like, it's more basically on the parties and the leaders space and all. So that's also a big issue. So suppose if I am in a constituency, I won't know my MP, member of parliament, I won't know my MLA, but I will know who the chief minister is or who that person belongs to a party. So that's kind of a thing in India. Like, so.
How about just one more simple question of taking an institution that is found in the US and in India called affirmative action. What's the difference that you've noticed between the two, and especially the role of the current president of India in using something which you can link with affirmative action and the caste system? So how could you contrast the caste system with race in the US and the way and the mechanism of affirmative action as it's used either nationally or in certain regions of India?
Should I take this or Subhalakshmi?
Yeah, either or both. I mean, I want you one of you answer, and then I'm asking because having just a little bit of dramatic differences in what instead of saying people know the ones, especially if they're lower status, they may know government officials more. What does the context? What about the context does that sentence come from? Is what I'm trying to ask. So one big thing that people will talk about it with India internationally is the caste system is stronger in its workings than any other major country in the world. So how is that changing? And yet, how is it still present in the affirmative action institution is my narrow, trying to have a simple question which can be linked with these bigger things we've been talking about.
I think there have been some kind of positive impact with the caste system. People are getting more aware of the caste system and how it is like more dangerous and all. But on overall, if you look at that, like it's not changing. People belonging to lower caste, they are still over there. Like, government has tried like lot of schemes, welfare scheme and everything, but it is not changing. Their position is not changing. It's basically the people who get past that lower caste system, like people who get that economically, who become more like self-sufficient. Even from the lower caste, they don't cater the need of the people who belongs to lower caste. So it's something like, so if a person from a lower caste will get like economically well off, he will just forget that he is from a lower class and he'll just leave that class just like that. Even the leaders. So
you're answering a different question. You're saying, are there class or caste differences in India? And you're saying yes, but you're not answering the question of what's the role and just descriptively, how is affirmative action in India different from affirmative action in the US?
Yeah, so I'm asking, so I'm discussing like the caste system only. Within the caste, when the same caste person becomes to a different class, like caste becomes to a different like class, also it changes. So affirmative action is like, there are a lot of schemes that have been provided by the government of India to help the lower caste people, like the caste system, to abolish the caste system and everything, but it's still prevalent and it depends on the party who is in the center. So the caste politics is still prevalent over there in India, and it depends on different states. I can't just say like under one umbrella that the caste system has been like, different state has like different caste system. As you know, like India is like being diverse country. So it all depends on which state are we talking about and how we are dealing with it. Like, so if we talk about the affirmative action of the government, it can't be like under one umbrella. They are trying to embed it all the caste people to provide them equal opportunities and everything, but it's not happening like that because each state has its own dynamics of caste system. So like the state I come from, UP, it is predominantly belong to OBC, other backward caste and SC caste, but the state has not catered to their needs. State has been catering to the general caste. So that's why this is the biggest issue in the current election, upcoming election 2022. So that's how I'll say, like, that's how the government deals with the caste system in India. It's all like a political issue. It's not like something that they really cater about.
Okay, but so in a sense, maybe one of your bigger points for people around the world is even within India, where people write many books and news stories saying caste is very, very important. Your point is inside India, there are many variations, and especially at the state level. And the National Public Radio has had many interviews with candidates who say, now this may potentially threaten the president of the whole country because this particular woman is challenging him and with great success in her state and so forth. So in that way, this illustrates, well, okay, I don't want to go much further in the caste system per se, but I'm saying like, well, oh, sorry, let's hear from you, Shamanti. So you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Just to add to that, I also think that one of the reasons why low-income communities, especially in, I mean, though this is not true just for urban areas, I mean, I can speak for urban areas because it's a very evident pattern, especially when an election is around the corner. You can see how mobilization works. And I feel like a lot of local MPs emerge from these communities, which are based somewhat on caste lines, but also on community lines, because that's how rural to urban migration works. The recruitment that happens, and then the people that make that low income population in that particular area will be linked to each other based on a particular identity. I mean, it usually is caste, but because caste is becoming a much more diverse thing under contemporary circumstances, it's also community. So I feel like Abhishek was saying, there are a lot of schemes that the state governments and central governments introduce in order to help improve the conditions of those who are belonging to marginalized castes. But then a lot of the benefits of such schemes, and also sort of like marginal benefits which aren't really on paper but still exist, they reach these populations through these not community appointed, but like favored by the community local MLAs and MPs, which is why I feel there is a lot more knowledge and participation within those colonies than there is in the more affluent colonies, because the affluent colonies don't need those benefits as much, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, these are all helpful. What I'm trying to do explicitly is to bring out and to listen to yourselves in making these points. How much am I talking about the context of so what we can call stratification, whether it's income differences or relative status differences, or changes in these, transformations in these, and then what might be the role of either global factors or very local factors, and or things that connect the two, such as political parties or new candidates within each of these. And so you're mentioning these several kinds of things, but in a sense, I'm trying to connect what your comments are, take them out, that is, not take them away from India, but connect the bigger framework so that you can articulate more, what are the factors I'm talking about, and why am I choosing these rather than 7 other things that might be in a framework which have been discussed in other countries around the world. Okay, so that's all helpful. Let's see. We had Dean Casey, do you have anything you wanted to bring in as a different theme?
I didn't really have a different theme, but I just been listening.
Okay, fair amount. Aaron Waldis? Wadis? Yeah, Aaron.
Yeah, Wildis. It's fine. Close enough. That's, yeah. Yeah, I think I'd been reading some of the new political culture this week, of course, and I think it was definitely interesting. We've kind of talked about it before, but just like the idea of like the cities being at the forefront of these changes you kind of talk about, and I don't know, the idea of like them being more responsive to citizens, and I kind of, you know, the interplay of like the national party and how that affects it. To be honest, I just generally really like the idea of like the party being talked about a little more, being a little more contextual about like the system of politics beyond just like, oh, is this a federal system? Oh, is this regional? Oh, is this blah, 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 whatever. I really like that idea of like focusing on like how the parties literally operate, which is of course very different among country to country, even if it's still, you know, the Communist Party or whatever. And even I think, you know, it's kind of an interesting case to kind of say back, you know, when the USSR was operative and the central locus of these communist parties, the interplay between those more local communist parties, say like the Communist Party of Indonesia, and how they might have interacted with like the quote unquote main communist party in the USSR, and the different varying powers that related to it. So sorry, I guess it's a little bit of a tangent from like what I started with, but kind of just saying kind of where those ideas got me thinking, and that it was definitely a really interesting idea here, and just focusing on parties more specifically as like a contextual component to the politics.
Okay, now that's excellent, and it's explicitly different if you look, say, at the book called Urban Innovation, which we did at the beginning of stuff like this, and contrast that with the new political culture. We repeat the same kinds of analyses so we can see how important is Democratic or Republican. So one of the big findings in the Urban Innovation book was at the local level, Democrats and Republicans, that is parties, don't explain much at all in how fiscally liberal a mayor says he is. That is, if you ask the mayors of all the cities, would you rather spend more, same, or less in each of these 15 areas? So we have all the mayors ranked in terms of more high spending versus low spending. And then you say, how strongly is that related to party? And it's almost zero in the US. In France, it's the opposite. In France, it's so strong that you only get slated for mayor of Lyon or Paris or another city if you follow that party program. So what we then, I mean, that's the tradition, at least. That's the big difference with the US, where we have Democratic and Republican parties, and they make people think they're important in Washington, but you go locally and it's very, very different. And we've looked at that in many different ways. But then if you begin to look at, in the new political culture book, we then take it a step further and we say, okay, Italy and France have much more strong parties, or they did, how much are they changing and how much are these patterns? And so we then compare individual mayors within each of the French cities, because we have these data, we have surveys where we ask those questions in these 20 countries. So we ask them, and we then see that there are some cases of individual outliers. So we've got papers on those. Grenoble, for example, Grenoble, Lyon, and then battles within the Socialist Party especially were important. These had mayors that fought against their national parties, and we've then measured those. But then what happened to those mayors who fought against their national parties in those cities that I've just mentioned in France? All three of these went to jail. The other people in the city council went out and looked for any dirt. This, you get dirt in Boston politics and Chicago politics. I mean, in France, they found enough to put these mayors in jail and to get them away from being mayor. So I'd make the general point that parties, the general point is parties are more strong in Europe, even if we have some exceptions, a few exceptions where people really fight against them. But the ones who fought the most and made national, international headlines suffered. So Durkheim made the general point in his Division of Labor book that people who, you can measure the strength of a value by seeing how strong are the reactions against it. So if the crime, is punishable by death or by life imprisonment instead of $27, that says that's a measure of how. And so Durkheim wrote that in 1900, something like that, 50 years before there were any social surveys, before there were any quantitative measures of doing this kind of thing. Durkheim and Weber were inventing ways of doing content analysis or systematizing these things because they wanted their theories. They wanted their theories to connect with evidence in a systematic way. Whether you read the text of the French rules of the game, the legal system from the Roman law, or common law in the English tradition, which worked sometimes very differently. Okay, we're at the end of our hour. We will continue with office hours now. Read on, and we'll discuss more on Wednesday.